Some years ago, I heard a story about a professor of physics. He was preparing his students for the final exam. Most of these students were failing the entire semester, and their grade hinged on this one exam. This professor was known to be the most difficult in all of the schools, so difficult that they were scared and believed that a normal review would not be enough to help them pass the exam. One guy threw his hand up. The professor said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Would you allow us to have an open book test?" The professor said, "Absolutely not." And he continued the review. A few minutes later, the young man's hand went back up again. He said, "Would you do something? There's no way we can pass this test on our own. We need your help." The professor thought for a moment. He said, "I've never done this in the 30 years that I've been teaching in the science department. But here's what I'll do. I'll allow you to use a single sheet of paper. You take this home and you put anything on it that you want. You bring it back and you take the exam. But if you agree to this, the review is over." And they all said, "Yes, we'll sign up for that because your review is not going to help us. We need help beyond that." The guy that had raised his hand one last time and said, "Are you telling me we can put anything on this paper?" He said, "That's the only rule I have. One sheet of paper, anything on it. It's the only rule. If you will obey this rule, you should do well on the test." And he ended the class. Over the next few days, people would get their 8.5 by 11 plain sheet of paper, and they would get their physics books, and they would write equations. They would write definitions. They would put chapter and verse from side to side, top to bottom, front and back. But not the other guy, the one that raised his hand. He had a different plan. So the day of the exam, they all rushed into the class, people with their piece of paper. You could not see white on the paper. There was so much writing, except for the young man. You could see white everywhere, for it was blank. Everybody else was in the class. There was a couple of minutes before he would shut the door and administer the exam. The guy was standing at the head of the classroom. He would look out the front doors to the lecture hall into the parking lot, and then he would look back at the clock. He would look out, and then he would look back at the clock, and he said, "Oh, no, my plan may have backfired." So he walks in the class with about a minute to spare, and he sits down dejected with a blank sheet of paper on his desk. And just before the professor would shut the door, this older gentleman walks in the back. The young man heard the gentleman walk in, and he looked to the back of the classroom, and there it was, his big brother. His big brother was the head of the science department at a neighboring university. He smiled and waited for his big brother to come up, the professor watching every step his colleague would take, thinking all the while, what is he doing? And then the little brother at the front of the classroom took his blank sheet of paper, set it right beside his desk, and he motioned to his big brother to stand on that piece of paper. And his big brother stood on that piece of paper, and his feet fit perfectly. The professor then looked at this man, his colleague, the head of the science department at a neighboring university, and then at that student, and realized he had been duped. But he was well within the rules, so he gave a nod of approval. And when the young man began his test, he looked at the first question and then looked up to his brother and said, "I need help." And then he looked at the second question and looked at his brother and said, "I need help." Every question, every definition, every equation, he would look up to his brother and say, "I need help." And his brother would look down and say, "Don't worry about it. I got this one. Don't worry about it. I got this one. Don't worry about it. I got this one," until he took the entire exam for the little brother. For if the little brother had taken it himself, he would have failed. A few days later, they came back to get their grades, and many of the people in the class made grades that were less than desirable. But not this young man. When he picked up his examination, he had a 100, an A+. He had passed everything, answered every question directly, every equation directly. He did not miss a single thing. Or did he? Technically, he did. Technically, he made a zero. He didn't answer a single thing. He couldn't. He was inable, incapable. But according to the rules, his brother stepped in, took the test for him, so his brother's grade was applied to his exam in a similar way. This is what Paul is saying. God's plan is that you would be right, but you can't be based on your own effort. Because you've sinned just like I've sinned. And because of that, God sent someone to take the exam for us. And his name is Jesus. As Jesus stands in the gap, it's just as if we had never sinned. We can be justified. We can be right with God.